Hi, old guy here. This might seem to be the wrong kind of topic to be discussing around Christmas, but given the year that we've just had, I think horror is spot on. The other day I was on some video site and I ran across one from this guy who listed the top 10 horror novels of all time, and well, no, they weren't. Over half of them were more properly classified as science fiction or thrillers, not horror. Now, in the guy's defense, horror has been ill-defined, and most books thus categorized are so because either some expert said they were, or there's a general consensus by the public that they are. You really need to stop listening to these people. Horror is pretty much viewed as anything that scares you, which is a category so broad as to make it meaningless. I mean, poison ivy scares me, but unless it becomes self-aware and starts chasing me around the yard, then it's not horror. Serial killers are not horror either, although they can be horrifying. Neither are tyrannical, oppressive governments like in that catching fire or starting a campfire or whatever that thing was, and neither are bleak post-apocalyptic landscapes like Cormac McCarthy's The Road, although it comes pretty close. Scaring you is only part of the formula. There are at least two other elements necessary before it can be considered true horror. First, some supernatural influence, preferably associated with religious concepts of good and evil. The supernatural element doesn't have to be an actual supernatural force, but an adherence, a belief, a dedication to it of some kind. That's why Red Dragon is a horror novel, while Silence of the Lambs is not. Lambs is actually a thriller. And second, there has to be a sense of helplessness in the face of forces too powerful for mortals to comprehend, much less combat. In other words, ghosts and monsters and witches and cults and entities and demons and their acolytes or their worshippers, those are horror novels. Everything else is either science fiction, a thriller, or a crime novel. You can see already how my definition violates the norms. For example, let's use Alien and Aliens. Those are considered horror movies, but they're not. They're actually science fiction. Now, scary science fiction to be sure, but scaring you is not sufficient of a criteria. The aliens are science-based, not supernatural. And there's no sense of helplessness against them. You just gotta find the right weapon. Hannibal Lecter is a criminal, not a monster, although that's an apt one-word description of his sociopathology. And elves and dwarves and hobbits and dragons are part of a world-building exercise, although there's plenty of supernatural things like wizards and Balrogs running around in those books. You expect wizards and Balrogs, though. So it's not a sense of helplessness that overwhelms the hobbits, but the need to deal with what used to be a distant problem. That sense of helplessness is key. When normalcy is confronted by something unnatural, the normal human responses are rendered ineffective, and the human has to look beyond his usual resources for a solution. Hannibal Lecter can be shot, but what do you do about Dracula? Need a cross and garlic, which is just silly in the human world. But unless you do that, you are helpless before the Lord of the Vampires. So, given this rather long-winded preamble and my criteria, the 10 best horror novels of all time. Number 10, Dracula. Stoker's compilation of old wives' tales and folk tales and legends and the person of Count Dracula, an evil creature bent on slaughter and domination, remains the classic horror novel. In fact, probably the first true horror novel. Although, yes, I know there are ones that precede it, such as Le Fanu's Carmilla and Walpole's The Castle of Otranto. But Dracula is light years beyond those. Stoker pulls no punches. The Count is evil and malevolent and has no redeeming value, and there is no compromise with him, and he is damned near impossible to kill, at least by human methods. Stoker introduced the time-honored horror trope of the unexpected expert. Jonathan Harker and Mina and the rest of the gang are helpless before Count Dracula's onslaught until Van Helsing shows up. One of the best aspects of this novel is the aftermath. No one remains untouched. No one remains unscarred. Which is the nature of evil. It corrupts everyone it touches. Number 9. At the Mountains of Madness by H.P. Lovecraft. Okay, alright, it's not actually a novel. It's a story collection with only the title story long enough to be considered a novella. But these stories form the core of the Cthulhu mythos, one of the most terrifying alternate realities in literature. With its old ones and sacrifices and Dunwich horrors and distorted, malevolent gods intent on eating us. Lovecraft almost single-handedly created the dark forces genre, and King and Conley and Straub really owe him a big thanks. Was Lovecraft racist? Oh, distressingly so. Was his prose turgid and stiff? Oh, you betcha. But his descriptions of the horrors lurking in the dark will curl your hair. Number 8. The Exorcist. The movie was scary as crap and ushered in the entire demons are gonna get you flicks of the 1970s like the Amityville Horror and The Omen. But all of those missed the novel's larger point. Our souls are battlegrounds for ancient powers. An unbelieving world dismisses those powers as quaint relics of a superstitious age, at its peril. Number 7. The Dead Zone. I've railed about Stephen King and other places, and most of his usual suspects like It and Pet Sematary are not on this list, but this novel is. It centers around the Uncle Ben adage that with great power goes great responsibility. When an accident gives Johnny Smith the ability to tell the future whenever he grasps someone's hand, he decides to use his power for the betterment of mankind, with terrible results. Number 6. Red Dragon. My only entry of the serial killer slasher type novels, which I generally categorize as thrillers, because this serial killer, dubbed the Tooth Fairy, is doing all his butchering so he may transform into something else. William Blake's Red Dragon. If you've ever seen the painting, that ain't Smog or any other delightful type dragon you find in literature. That is the devil. And while there are no actual supernatural elements in this book, the Tooth Fairy's enthusiastic dedication to his task makes up for it. This book introduces a minor character you may have heard of named Hannibal Lecter, who just isn't as interesting as the Tooth Fairy. This is a much better novel than The Silence of the Lambs, which was in itself a pretty good novel. Number 5, Salem's Lot. This Stephen King novel is, in my opinion, sheer genius. Or pretty close to genius anyway. The vampire in this novel is the traditional Stoker type, not something cool or angst-ridden or glittery like we've had to put up with lately. But worse than the vampire is the vampire's familiar, a character named Straker, who ever since the 1979 TV series I've always pictured as James Mason. It's quite something that you actually become more afraid of the familiar than the monster itself. Number 4, The Other. You could easily make the argument that this does not meet my criteria because there's no clear supernatural element here. Holland and Niles seem like your typical creepy 13-year-old twins. But are they actually twins? Are they actually alive? Who knows? That uncertainty gives this extraordinarily well-written novel an air of constant dread. Number 3, The Returned. More eerie than frightening, this is one of the most unnerving zombie novels written. Well, technically, I guess they're not zombies. They're more actually revenants. But we don't know why they're coming back from the dead, and there could be voodoo involved. Could be. The zombies don't want to eat our brains. They just want to resume their lives so rudely interrupted when they died a year or a decade or a few centuries ago. This is a bit off-putting to those of us who are not dead. Half the time, this novel is a moral tale of acceptance and a metaphor for prejudice, but dead people coming back and asking for their houses and their jobs, well, that's maybe a bridge too far, especially when no one has any idea why this is happening. Number 2, Nosferatu. Apples not falling far from trees, and it is good that Joe Hill, Stephen King's son, completely understands the nature of horror. More so, it seems, than his dad does, at least recently. This is a scary, scary book about a monster or a ghoul or a vampire, not really sure what he is, who keeps himself young by corrupting the souls of children. Yes, there's some odd elements, such as the telekinetic teleportation powers of the heroine, Victoria McQueen, but all forgivable because Hill just weaves it all together so well. And my number 1 horror novel of all time, Night World. This is absolutely the most hair-raising novel I have ever read. There are scenes that made me gasp out loud. Maybe I'm just a sucker for end-of-the-world, Goddard-Damerung, apocalyptic divine judgment novels. Are there really that many of those? But this remains for me the best horror novel ever. That may come as a surprise because Wilson is kind of scattershot. He tried to create a horror series around a character named Repairman Jack, but it didn't really go anywhere. Night World is a Repairman Jack novel, the last of what Wilson loosely called the adversary cycle. You probably know the first book, The Keep, which was made into a pretty decent movie. But it and the other adversary novels don't really seem connected to each other. Until you get to this one, which will blow you away. So, that is my top 10. Feel free to put your own candidates in the comments. And if I don't see you before Christmas, have a merry one. And if I don't see you before New Year's, good God, let's hope 2021 is better. Old guy here. See you later.